Hey, physics peeps, welcome back. We're going to look into drawing X and Y components. Drawing X and Y components is actually kind of backwards of what we had just learned with adding vectors together and drawing the displacement. We're going to take a displacement and draw vectors that make it up, or the components. But the components are very specific. They are X and Y. When we say X and Y, it's a lot like on a graph. Like you have an X-axis that runs side to side, or horizontally, you have the Y-axis that runs vertically. The X and Y components are that. The X component is a horizontal line, and the arrow can be pointing either way, either to the right or to the left. And the Y component is a vertical line that could be either pointing up or it could be pointing down. But we combine one X component and one Y component to make up what is the components that make up the displacement. There we go. That's what I was looking for. So when we draw these, we take this displacement here, and we try to find two vectors, one X, one Y, that will make up that one displacement. Again, X can be either going right or left, and Y could either be going up or down. The way it goes, though, is just like drawing a map. We have a start and we have a finish. And this displacement vector goes from the start to finish. But when we draw the X, we always draw the X component first. And we draw a horizontal line from where we started over this way. How far we draw that horizontal line, though, is we draw it so that it ends right underneath the finish mark, or the end of the resultant, or the displacement vector. So we draw it like this. And this arrow is going to the right. We label it X because that's our horizontal line. It's our X component. The Y component we draw as a vertical line. It's either going up or down, but this one is combined tip to tail with our X component, and it makes it all the way to the finish. So we go up from where we left off, and we go straight up to the tip of our displacement arrow. And this we label our Y component because it's vertical. So these are my two components, X and Y. Notice that it makes a right triangle. And that's basically what we're doing. The X component, it's this part. The Y component, it was this part. And most cases, though, we're going to be drawing it out like this. I'll show you another example here. Okay? So if I was given a displacement vector, like this one in the red, I want to draw X and Y components that represent that. So I start with my X. I always start with my X, and you'll see why later. But I always start where my other arrow starts. And I draw a horizontal line. It follows the X-axis, and it stops directly underneath this arrow. So going out this far, that doesn't work. And that's not X component. The X component stops directly underneath this arrow. And so there is my X component, and I'm going to label it X. My Y component has to run parallel to the Y-axis. It starts where I left off with the X component, and it goes up until I reach the tip of the displacement. And I label this y. These are my x and y components. Notice that it makes a right triangle, and that's what you need to do. And I'd like you to pause the video, and I'd like you to do this on your own. First of all, I want you to copy this thing down, Copy this down onto your sheet of paper. And then I'd like you to do this one on your own. Pause the video. I want you to draw x and y components for this arrow. All right, let's check what we got. When we draw x and y components, I'm going to show you really quick things that you can do, things that you should not do. So here's we go. And x and y components. This is not the correct x component. This, this is not an x component. And we always draw our x component first. You start where the other one started, and you go horizontally until you're directly underneath the tip of that arrow. And I label it x. That is my x component. My y component goes from where I left off and comes up to the tip of that arrow. And I label it y. So another way to kind of think of it is that this arrow is coming up and to the right. I should have two arrows when I draw my x and y components. One is going up and one is going to the right. These two arrows do the same thing as this arrow does. It's just we're breaking it up into components. Why are we breaking it up into components? Is really kind of goes back to something that you probably learned in math and with coordinates, because these two things kind of, like I said, do the same thing as this. If we think of it like points on a graph, we say that this arrow comes up to the point it goes over 2 on the x-axis, and it goes up 1 on the y-axis. So that's the point where that's at. And our x component goes over 2. That's the x component here. And the y component, it's 1. That's awesome. These two things do the same thing as this one vector does. But we'll see more kind of a handy reason why we use this. It makes actually some things simpler for us to deal with things horizontally and vertically than to deal with things at angles. So we'll get into that later. But here we goes. I'd like you to copy onto your paper the next two. See if you can draw x and y components for these two things. And remember, when you do this though, you draw your x component first and then you draw your y component. And go ahead and pause the video and try it out. All right, let's check this out. Again, I'm going to show this. When we draw x and y components, this is not x and y components. These are not x and y components. And this is not an x and y component. And when we draw x and y components, you always start from where this arrow started. Our x component comes over here to the right, and I'm going to show the arrow going to the right. The tip of that arrow needs to be directly below, or in this case, above, where the tip of the green arrow is. And my y component actually starts right here where my x component ended. I'm going to label it x. And it goes to the tip of the other arrow. I'm going to label it y. This green arrow is coming down and to the right. I have an x component that goes to the right, and I have a y component that goes down. So it does the same thing as this. When I look at the purple arrow over on the right-hand side, and I want to draw x and y components, a lot of people tend to do something that's like this. But these are not x and y components for that, because this is not going perpendicular to the x-axis, that doesn't work. And, and something like this also doesn't count as x and y components because this is not following the x-axis. And so that doesn't work. And this one's kind of weird because if you were to draw x and y components for it, really you can only draw one of them. And it is the x component for that vector. We say there's only the x component for it and that the y component is 0. There is no y component because that line is only going horizontal. It's not going up or down any. So this is kind of how we would say it. This is all in the x, and then you have your y component, it's equal to 0. Okay. I'm going to show you a little bit of what you're doing for your assignment, and then I'll kind of let you go on your own. So what I'd like you to do is go to Google Classroom, and when you go to today's assignment, you should end up seeing this. Oops. This assignment here and there. And where it says homework 1 vector or homework vectors 1, it should have your name in front of it as well. When you go in there though, you'll end up seeing things like this. If you can't see the yellow boxes, make sure that you can use the zoom tool that's over on the upper left. You can zoom in and zoom out, but you want to see the yellow boxes. They give you instructions on what you need to do in case you forget. But for this very first part, you are taking some vectors that they give you over here on the side, and you are going to be putting them together over here in these other little graph spaces. And when it says a plus b, it really just means you take vector a. You can click and drag that over here to the graph area, and you're going to add b to it. But when you add b, make sure that you add it tip to tail. So not like this, where it's tail to tail, and not like this, where it's tip to tip. And tip to tail would be like you put a, and then it connects with the tail of b. So that's adding a tip to tail. But then you're going to use the red arrows to show the displacement vector. That always starts where a started, and it goes to where it ends, or where your last vector ends. And you're going to be doing that with some of the other vectors here, like c plus e, and then you'll have some other examples on other slides. Okay. When you get to slide 4, you have your friend that ended up adding some vectors together and drawing the displacement, but they didn't draw the or label the displacement. And you have to choose which one of these things actually represents the displacement in each of the diagrams. And you can move the red circles around and circle the correct answer in each one. Is it like A, B, or C? Then, when you get to these, here are some displacement vectors, and you have to draw x and y components for it. So the x is in blue, the y is in the orange. So when we say draw the x and y components, it is taking the x arrow. It can either be going to the right or it could be going to the left. But remember that it starts where this arrow starts, and you draw that one first or put that one in first, and the tip of this arrow goes directly underneath the tip of this one. The y component, it can either be going up or down, so you can adjust these if you need to, but you're going to add it to the x, so it goes to the tip of x, to the tail of the y, and this one reaches all the way up to the tip of our displacement arrow. And so that's how I can put my x and y components in. But down here in the boxes, I also have to tell the value of the x and y, because x, it actually has a size to it. It also has a direction. So when I'm writing out x, this x arrow goes to the left 4 spaces. Each block can just equal one value. So I am putting, say my x is -4. My y goes up 4 spaces. So I say my y is 4. Try them out. Ask your teacher if you have questions.